All right, the weekend, what does it bring in terms of this Trump-Mueller investigation story?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Kind of chief clear thinker for this program, Timothy Edgar, senior fellow in international affairs at Brown University, is my guest this evening. We tape in the afternoon. Sometimes I mess that up. But, the weekend now is, I think, a time for people to digest the Mueller report. Funny, I talked to a guy who I'm very fond of and have high respect for, a major business guy in this community earlier today. And he's kind of a Trump fan, and he and I chide each other from time to time. We're going back and forth over this whole thing, and I finally just asked, well, did you read the report? He's like, no, I don't have time for that. And that, I think, is going to be an overriding concept here. You know, the idea that many Americans don't have time for that. And I think Democrats better be pretty smart about factoring that into this whole thing. But I'm interested to see what Tim has to say about that. Great to have you in. Thanks very much for tuning into the program. Just a couple of local notes. Stop and Shop strike is over, thank goodness. You know what was one of the real impacts of this strike? In addition to the challenge for everyday employees who certainly took a high risk with this thing, all the other supermarkets, I didn't realize how tightly or naturally cyclically organized the economy of retail food shopping is. Everyone else was nuts, Dave's and Shaw's, we don't have anything, and parking lots were full, and security was being called not for Stop and Shop, but for the other places because of the fighting and the Easter Sunday, and they're just trying to. It's amazing that everything is kind of configured to market share. Everyone's got their piece, and when one falls out, the whole thing kind of gets nuts. So quality of life for everybody, I think, is going to get back to somewhat of a normal thing with the Stop and Shop strike. We'll dig into some of the details on that over the course of the next few days, both here on the TV and the radio, to see whether this was a move that was good for them or not. They certainly are saying it was a big success, meaning labor, meaning the union. They're all about that they got just about everything they wanted. So we'll see. In the meantime, interesting story on the front page of the Providence Journal today. Raimondo tax returns. We are very money oriented, right? Or at least the journalists around here seem to be. Everybody wants to know what everybody makes. And FYI, maybe you want to give it a read. Gina Raimondo, our governor, had a nice hit in 2018 because her blind trust paid her near $1 million, and it upped her income to $1.5 million or whatever in her joint return. And then everybody else is listed down there in terms of what they paid in taxes, and meaning most state officers and federal officers are listed in there. Everyone's jumping on this tax return bandwagon if they haven't in the past because of the President of the United States. And he's really kind of the underpinning of this conversation, because inside that article it notes again that the Senate recently passed in committee by a large vote, actually I think it was across the board in the Senate, again a 28-10 vote to make it mandatory for your tax returns to be released in order for you to qualify for being on the presidential ballot. Now, truth be told, that is specifically designed for Donald Trump. And 17 states have introduced the legislation. I'm not sure that any have passed them yet. I'm interested in my guest take on this. Tim Edgar is with us here to talk primarily about the Mueller report. But welcome, my friend. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
What do you think about that?
Well, presidents and candidates should totally reveal their tax returns. That's an important part of our transparency. But I worry a little bit about damage to our institutions if people feel like they're not able to vote. I mean, there are people who want to vote for Trump in this state, and if that's not listed on the ballot, I don't think the Trump campaign is going to care. I mean, they're not going to get Rhode Island's electoral votes anyway. But it could do further damage to our democracy. So I think unless all the states are doing it, or a big chunk of states are doing it so that you have to comply, it could just be more partisan warfare.
Well, the should release tax returns thing is interesting. Should return tax returns because of transparency regarding transactional relationships with those who may come into conflict of interest, I guess, is the primary motive.
Yes, and so the public will understand where their candidates are getting their money from. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders, for example. He's had some controversy over the fact that, he's now a millionaire. We wouldn't know that if he hadn't had some pressure to release his tax returns.
Okay. I agree with you. I do not think it is a good thing for America to have one or many states that don't qualify the incumbent president on the ballot. I mean, at some juncture, I think we need to recognize, though, that oversight committees have their own special arguments about demanding, seeking, or petitioning the IRS. Richie Neal at House Ways and Means right now is doing his best to nail the IRS to cough that stuff up. That's investigative in nature. That I'm okay with. But this other thing,
I think the concern I have is the idea that if you had a few deeply blue states that just knock Trump off the ballot because he refuses to release his tax returns when he absolutely should, is that just going to further our polarization? Now, if we had a rule for the whole country that you have to release your tax returns if you want to run for president, I'd be all in favor of that.
but that'd be a federal statute.
Yeah, federal statute, or maybe if you had a very large number of states. If we had a rule like, for example, with the National Vote Compact in Rhode Island, we've passed that where we'll move to popular vote instead of the Electoral College, but only if all the states sign up to it.
Kind of as an aside, I don't think we should do anything out of fear or favor here, but on the fear side, can you imagine Rhode Island, one of a handful of states that say you're not on the ballot, he wins? How much federal dough you think is coming our way?
Well, yes, I mean, that's another point. It just sort of puts us in the crosshairs. But again, I think the principle here is a clear one, which is that people need faith in their democracy, and that's really what the Mueller report was all about, too.
Okay, so let's talk about the Mueller report. That's why Tim is here. Let's put up a headline here and talk about now the challenge the Democrats have to impeach or not to impeach. That is the question. Here's the Weekend's network take on all of that.
A lot of great things happening for our country. Thank you very much.
As President Trump attended Easter services in Palm Beach, special counsel Robert Mueller avoided questions outside his church in Washington.
Will you testify before Congress, sir?
No comment.
It's the first time we've heard Mueller speak since being appointed special counsel. The president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, insisted it's acceptable to take information about an opponent from a foreign adversary.
There's nothing wrong with taking information from Russians.
Though the former prosecutor wouldn't recommend it.
I would have advised, just out of excess of caution, don't do it.
Congressman Jerry Nadler questioned why Mueller did not bring charges against those in the infamous June 2016 Trump Tower meeting. Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and then Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, who met with a Russian lawyer promising dirt on Hillary Clinton.
They went to the meeting. That's conspiracy right there.
But in his report, Mueller explained he didn't bring charges against them because he could not prove they willfully sought to commit a crime. Senator and 2020 hopeful Elizabeth Warren distinguished herself among her Democratic rivals by unequivocally calling for impeachment over the weekend.
We have a Constitution of the United States, and it says when a president engages in this kind of activity, then it's time for impeachment.
But House Oversight Committee Chairman Democrat Elijah Cummings was more cautious.
I'm not there yet, but I can foresee that possibly coming.
Well, I don't know. This is the this is the question of our day.
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure it should be. I don't know that you employ a strategy that you know in the end is not going to be effective. Impeachment. I bet you if you asked 10 Americans at the mall whether impeachment kicks out a president, they probably say, yeah, I think so.
Right.
Right? I mean, there's a trial in the Senate that follows the indictment,
Right.
the impeachment by the House of Representatives. Your thought on this whole debate. Give me your 60-second summary, then we'll dig into the report.
Sure. Well, I think we talked about this on the radio, but I think your idea was well taken. Is there conduct here that would allow the House to vote articles of impeachment? I think absolutely that's true. But the question is, what's best for the country right now? And I think that one of the biggest problems when you read the whole Mueller report, is you recognize this was an attack on our democracy by a foreign power, by Russia. What are we doing about that? How are we correcting those flaws and making sure they don't happen again? And I think the biggest failure of Donald Trump is really on that front, just refusing to recognize reality, denying it, saying no, this wasn't happening, and then obstructing the investigation. So instead of talking about does that mean we should remove him from office, I think we actually need the bigger question of what are we going to do to protect our democracy is actually the most important question.
All right, when we come back, we'll dig into the difference between the two. Stay with us.
With respect to most of those acts involving the meeting at Trump Tower, involving the provision of polling data, involving the discussions between the National Security Advisor and the Russian ambassador, all these and so many more, Kellyanne Conway and the President of the United States called this fake news, disputed that these facts were even facts. The obstruction of justice in particular in this case is far worse than anything that Richard Nixon did. The break-in by the Russians of the democratic institutions, a foreign adversary, far more significant than the plumbers breaking into the Democratic headquarters. So yes, I would say in every way this is more significant than Watergate.
You know, it's really interesting. I don't think Americans see it that way.
Yeah.
I think Americans see they see a tangible response. They see, you know, gaps in tapes. They see a break-in feels like a crime.
Right.
Social media and information manipulation is such an intangible for most Americans. I don't think Adam Schiff is on the same page. He may be trying to instruct right there, but I don't see him on the same page. Do you?
Well,
I don't think Americans see it that way.
I think part of the problem is we've allowed our focus to be taken off the Russians and put just on this kind of question of, is Trump going to survive or is he going to get kicked out? And I actually think that's the much less important question than what do you do about Russia's breaking in to the Democratic National Committee virtually. What do you do about the troll factory that was used to manipulate social media? These are big questions, I think, and they are more important than the dirty tricks of the Nixon campaign, but we've gotten ourselves focused entirely on what about Trump when we've taken our eyes off the ball of the threat from the Russians.
So interesting. First of all, Schiff's first point in that edited commentary there from the weekend, to his point, he is correct in something that people ought to recognize, that for the most part, the press reports on the saga of this whole thing have been on the money.
Absolutely right, and that's one of the things that the Mueller report helps to establish, is that we have a report with credibility that says here's what actually happened.
And the press was on the money. The press is credible.
The press was credible in virtually all of those stories about what happened during the election campaign and what happened after the election campaign.
Less one BuzzFeed story that had everybody
That's right. I mean, there were times when they got it wrong, and to me, the biggest thing, which was not part of what Mueller was talking about, was not a crime, but the denial of reality, the lying by Trump and by the other Trump people, to me is really far worse, because we're talking about a serious national security issue, and the president not only isn't doing anything about it, he's actually going out and lying about the reality that it is actually an attack.
So let's go to that. So Tim alluded to a comment that I had made on the Friday radio program, where I'd said in my dream of dreams that if the Democrats really love the country and are concerned about the country first, that they would make a deal, that they would go to Trump, you know, Nancy and Chuck, you know, go over and say, all right, here's the deal, man. This Russian intervention is bad for all of us, bad for the country. You admit that you took too many meetings, or the campaign did, that you played footloose and fancy-free, maybe not colluding, conspiring, but you were wading in dirty water there. We admit that the election is legitimate. We don't impeach, and you form with us a commission that goes 100 miles an hour after this Russian worry. That would be my America First bipartisan solution. Most people laugh at it over the idea, over the weekend. Yeah, fat chance, because no one believes that we're conditioned to do the right thing for the country right now.
And I think that's exactly the problem, is that we don't have that faith. And so how do you restore it? And I guess that's part. I've been thinking about impeachment a lot myself, and I think that it's something that House could legitimately pursue. The question is it the right thing to do? And my sense is it would further all of the things that are a problem in our democracy right now. The kind of approach you're describing would be far superior. And the only concern is that it's hard for us to imagine Trump agreeing to that deal. But, you know,
if they're private and public simultaneously, they literally go to the Oval Office and they come out to the Rose Garden. They tell them what they, you know, unless we get a live camera thing, which we've seen before, right? Wouldn't that be great to have a live camera thing in the Oval Office where they literally make that presentation to him and he reacts by gut? But if they came out and reported that and he didn't play ball,
yeah,
he's finished in 2020. Even the base would say, come on now.
Well, I certainly would hope that. I mean, I think one of the problems with the whole Trump presidency has been kind of this reality show quality to it. And, you know, what's the best, you know, in some ways the impeachment drama would play to that, you know, element in Trump's appeal is this is just another chapter in the reality show. Now we get to do impeachment. So I worry that Trump might say, bring it on, you know, I don't care. But certainly what should happen, the right thing for the country to happen, is to take stock of what actually happened in 2016 and to come clean about it. And we haven't seen that yet. It's hard to imagine it'll happen in the future, but that's really what should happen.
Bottom line on the investigation, you know, you weave back into like the fact pattern of the case and the whole thing. And I mean, nobody has said anything more brilliantly than the next about, you know, the fine lines that Bob Mueller has brought his investigation to, both on the conspiracy side and the obstruction side. Is there something that you've seen that hasn't been said about this? I mean, for the most part, I think Americans' eyes are rolling in the back of their heads, A, even if they read it, because there's a lot of disagreement, even if you read the report, and B, those who don't read it just want to be where they want to be. Is there
Right.
Is there something about the play-by-play of the investigation that you think hasn't been said? You know, you can make national news with this. I can't think.
Yeah.
No one has said anything. Everyone needs to listen to everybody else, realizing that everybody has said something about this thing that is common to someone else's interpretation, which leaves us in a zero-sum game anyway.
Well, I think that my own sense is just you had two volumes of this report. Volume 1 was about collusion, allegedly, about the Russia interference campaign and whether the Trump campaign was playing footsie with it. And Volume 2 is about obstruction. Everybody kind of wanted to jump to Volume 2 because they were thinking, well, this is going to be the thing that gets Trump, is the obstruction. I really think Volume 1 is the more important volume. I think that, you know, the Russian interference campaign was a direct threat to our national security. And what it established is it established that there wasn't enough evidence to prove a criminal conspiracy, but it did also establish that Trump was playing footsie with these guys. We've got to make that unacceptable. It's got to be, you know, again, it's got to be the case that political parties, you know, talk to each other, that they have an American election campaign, that they're not benefiting from outside interference. And to me, that's the most important question that we need to establish.
And so, you know, as you're making that eloquent point, I'm thinking, and my idea that we have this powwow settlement where he admits and blah, 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 is there something that looms for him that prevents him from wanting to admit? And that is maybe buried in Southern District of New York investigations. Who knows?
Could be, although if you read Volume 2 carefully, one of the things that just jumps out at you, everyone around Trump, you know, the question is, well, why obstruct the investigation if you didn't actually conspire? And, you know, the answer was ego. It was as simple as that. It was, I want to have this election victory be my victory. I don't want people to think the Russians handed it to me. And as a result of that, he took so many reckless actions. So the question is there a way in which you could persuade the president to put that ego aside? And it seems very unlikely that that's going to happen.
All right, where do we go from here? How many times have I turned to the camera and said, next, where do we go from here? I don't know. We'll be right back. So you've got judiciary, you got oversight, you got ways and means, all with laser focus on the president, all Democratic, you know, committees. today's news, we've got Trump suing the Oversight Committee for their efforts to get financial records. Again, I see a big difference between we can't go on the ballot unless you got a tax return and legitimate oversight and pursuit of tax records or financial records. Richie Neal looking for tax in the IRS, that's going to be in the courts, seems to me. Well, this too now is going to end up in the courts. Do you think House Oversight has legitimacy, Tim, to be pursuing Trump's financial records, which is more than just taxes?
I think absolutely, especially given what we learned from the Mueller report. There's a lot of financial interests that Trump and the Trump organization have all over the world, and the public has every right to know about those financial interests, and the Congress has subpoena power for a reason. And I expect that the courts will rule that way, with perhaps some exceptions for legitimate privilege and things like that. My guess is that this is simply a tactic that Trump has taken from his business days of, litigate, sue, and
the lower federal courts may rule that way. The Supreme Court may not. So who knows?
It'll certainly drag things out. I mean, again, this is kind of a New York businessman tactic of just throwing everything out there and seeing what sticks. But again, one of the problems that I think with our current state of our political discourse, you need to have some cooperation between the executive and the legislative branch if you want to have effective oversight.
Oh, if we don't have a Mueller report, do we have this? I don't know. If we don't have, it's hard to go back and think about what the true genesis, intrinsically correct motivation is for these inquiries. A lot of Americans will say, "Wait a second, we knew he was a multi-platform real estate business guy. We didn't demand it to elect him. What the hell are you doing demanding it to keep him in the office?"
Well, it depends on particular decisions that are being made by the White House that might affect particular business interests around the world. So, you may even think it's okay to elect a president. That doesn't mean that you don't conduct oversight of particular activities.
30 seconds. Where are we going now? Where are we going now? A whole bunch of impeach or not impeach? Do we change the conversation? And who does?
Well, I certainly think there's going to be a lot more hearings in Congress on the Mueller report and the aftermath of that. But don't forget,
his visit will spike it again.
Sure, absolutely, and it'll be the first. It'll be a blockbuster testimony of the kind we haven't seen since Jim Comey, without any question. But don't forget that at the end of the Mueller report, there's about half a dozen other investigations referred to other places.
Answer is just stay tuned. Thanks for being available. Appreciate it. The final word, and we come back. All right, so was I way over? I'm not exactly sure how much time I have here, but I will. We have all that time? Okay. You know what? It's a good thing I can ad-lib for a living. Tomorrow night, the conversation will be about a really interesting acquisition/merger, call it what you want to, between Care New England and the parent company for Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. There has been a lot of worry about, it's just going to take away a lot of the medical brain power here in Rhode Island, and the truth be told, it doesn't seem that way. By all accounts, based on a radio conversation I had with the executives of each company last week, it looks like a pretty good deal. They will return here tomorrow night to talk about that, so make a note. We'll talk to you on the radio at 3 on WPRO as well. Thanks for tuning in.